The dust coated everything, settling thick and gray on the worn canvas of the wagon, on the threadbare shawl pulled tight around Eleanor's shoulders, on the very air she breathed. It tasted of grit and despair, a constant, choking reminder of her circumstances. Behind her, the plains stretched flat and indifferent, a vast, empty canvas under an equally vast, empty sky. Before her lay the promise of California, shimmering like a mirage in the heat haze, a destination she had been sold for, little more than cargo, a burden accepted by a man named Silas who needed passage for himself and saw her as a conveniently available commodity thanks to her aunt's desperate greed. Aunt Clara, whose tearful goodbyes had rung hollow against the clink of the coins Silas paid her, had spoken of opportunity, of a new life. Eleanor knew it was a lie, a convenient fiction to mask the shame of abandonment. She was 16, orphaned, and now beholden to a stranger whose eyes held no kindness and whose voice was a low rumble of impatience. Silas expected labor, obedience, and little else. She shared a small, cramped space beneath the wagon's tarp with crates and sacks, her bed a thin blanket on the hard ground when they camped. The days were long, a relentless march under the sun. The nights cold and filled with the alien sounds of the wilderness, the howl of a coyote, the creak of leather, the restless movements of the oxen. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every mile westward. She had little strength, less influence, and no protection save her own wits, which felt meager and dull with hunger and exhaustion. Among the disparate collection of families and individuals making this perilous journey, one figure stood apart. He traveled alone in a small, neat wagon painted a dark, unassuming green, pulled by a single sturdy horse. They called him Dr. Finch. He was a quiet man, tall and lean, with a reserved face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, yet revealed little. He kept to himself, his interactions with the others minimal, mostly limited to terse exchanges about road conditions or quiet assessments of a child's cough or an elder's complaint. Eleanor had only seen him from a distance, a solitary figure often walking beside his wagon, his gaze sweeping the horizon. There was an air of weary competence about him, an aura of self-possession that set him apart from the boisterous, fearful, or overly optimistic people around them. He was an island in the turbulent stream of the wagon train. Sometimes, when Silas was distracted or absent, Eleanor would allow herself a moment to simply observe him, a tiny spark of curiosity momentarily eclipsing the pervasive dread. What was his story? Why did a man of obvious education travel alone into the harsh frontier? The questions were idle, pointless, born of a desperate need for distraction. Yet they lingered. One evening, while fetching water from a muddy creek under Silas's impatient eye, she saw him tending to a limping ox, his movements gentle and practiced. He didn't seem to notice her, or perhaps he did and simply chose not to acknowledge her presence, a common enough occurrence for the unwanted. She dipped her bucket, the chill water a shock to her dust-parched hands, and hurried back to the wagon, the weight of the bucket less pressing than the weight on her spirit. The journey was a blur of hardship, aching muscles, perpetual thirst, the ever-present smell of sweat and wood smoke and manure. She saw glimpses of kindness among some of the families, small acts of sharing or help offered freely, but none were directed at her. She was Silas's burden, his property, and people were hesitant to interfere, wary of angering a man who held absolute power over another person, especially one so young and alone. Her aunt's betrayal felt like a physical wound, a gaping hole in the safety she had believed existed. She had been taught that family was a refuge, a bond stronger than any trial. Clara had proven that to be a comforting lie whispered to keep the weak compliant. Now, out here, surrounded by strangers and the unforgiving landscape, Eleanor understood the true nature of her isolation. Survival was a solitary endeavor, a silent battle waged within the confines of her own battered spirit. She learned to conserve her energy, to make the meager rations last, to shrink herself to be invisible. Her gaze rarely lifted from the dusty ground before her feet, scanning for loose stones or hidden obstacles, but never meeting the eyes of those around her. It was safer that way. The world had proven itself a place of sharp edges and bitter truths, and she was learning, quickly and brutally, how to navigate it by staying low and unnoticed. Yet, even in her carefully constructed anonymity, she felt the weight of observation, the fleeting glance from eyes that seemed to hold a depth she couldn't fathom. Dr. Finch. He was a quiet presence, a shadow at the edge of her awareness, and sometimes, just sometimes, she wondered if he saw more than the dust and despair that clung to her like a second skin. The true nature of Silas's arrangement became brutally clear as the miles wore on. He hadn't simply paid for her passage. He considered her indentured, bound to him for years upon arrival in California, not just as a servant, but as something more akin to a possession to be used or traded as he saw fit. His initial impatience curdled into outright cruelty. Her rations were cut further, her workload increased to the point of collapse. He spoke of selling her labor, or even her person, to wealthy ranchers needing wives or field hands. The veiled threats were constant, chipping away at her fragile hold on hope. "You belong to me now, girl," he'd sneer, his eyes cold and calculating. "Remember that. Your aunt saw fit to wash her hands of you, and I'm the one who took on the trouble. You owe me." The other members of the train mostly averted their eyes. Some muttered about the harsh realities of the journey, others about how some folks just weren't cut out for the frontier. Interference was risky, and Silas was a large, unpredictable man. Eleanor learned to flinch away from his touch, to keep her answers brief and subservient, to endure the gnawing hunger and the exhaustion that seeped into her bones. She no longer even thought about the future. Survival from one day to the next was her sole focus. During a particularly grueling stretch of the journey, where the heat was oppressive and water scarce, Eleanor collapsed while trying to lift a heavy crate. Silas cursed, kicking dust onto her prone form. "Get up, you lazy whelp. No time for play acting." Tears stung her eyes, not from pain, but from sheer, overwhelming despair. She couldn't move. Her muscles screamed in protest. From the corner of her eye, she saw a pair of boots stop nearby. Dr. Finch stood there, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak to Silas, didn't offer help directly. Instead, he looked at Eleanor, his gaze lingering for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, quietly, he addressed Silas. "Your ox seems off, Silas. Limping badly again. You push it like that, you'll lose it before we reach the mountains." Silas's attention snapped to his animal. Losing an ox could cripple his journey. He grumbled, distracted, and went to examine the beast, forgetting Eleanor for a precious few moments. It was a small thing, a seemingly casual observation, but it was enough. Eleanor managed to push herself up, trembling, using the wagon wheel for support. She stumbled away, finding a patch of shade under a stunted tree, gulping down air that felt thick with dust. She watched Finch work on the ox, his hands moving with quiet competence. He didn't look at her again. It wasn't a rescue, not in any dramatic sense, but it was an intervention, a subtle deflection of Silas's cruelty, bought with veterinary advice. It was the first time anyone had done anything that might remotely resemble help, however indirect. It confirmed her suspicion that he saw more than he let on. He saw her plight, and in his own way, he had offered a momentary reprieve. The thought was a tiny, fragile seed in the parched earth of her hope. She began to watch him more deliberately, though always from a distance, careful not to attract attention. She noted the way he cared for his horse, the quiet efficiency of his camp, the respect he showed to the few people who approached him for genuine medical help. He wasn't unkind, just reserved, burdened perhaps by his own silent history. She wondered about the wife he had lost, the one who had made him a widower and sent him west alone. Had she been kind? Had she loved him? The questions were another distraction from her own bleak reality, a way to populate the empty spaces in her mind with something other than fear. The landscape shifted, becoming more rugged, the plains giving way to rolling hills that promised the arduous climb of the mountains ahead. The air grew cooler in the evenings, carrying the scent of pine. The journey wasn't ending soon enough, but the changing scenery offered a different kind of monotony, a visual break from the endless flat horizon. Eleanor still belonged to Silas, still endured his casual cruelty and biting words. But now, she carried with her the memory of a quiet man's subtle intervention, a flicker of awareness from a pair of observant eyes that made her feel, for the briefest of moments, slightly less invisible, slightly less alone. The days blurred into a punishing routine of walking, working, and enduring. The ascent into the mountains was brutal. Wagons broke down, oxen faltered, tempers flared. Sickness spread through the train, a virulent fever that struck down young and old alike. Fear, already a constant presence, tightened its grip on the weary travelers. It was during this crisis that Dr. Finch ceased to be a distant observer and became a vital, indispensable part of the group. His quiet demeanor was replaced by focused action. He moved tirelessly from wagon to wagon, his black bag a symbol of grim hope. He treated the sick with a quiet competence that inspired grudging respect. His hands, which Eleanor had only seen tending to an ox, now ministered to fevered brows and trembling limbs. He spoke little, offering clear instructions, administering what few medicines he carried, and sometimes, simply sitting with the dying, offering a silent, comforting presence. Silas, fearing the fever, kept his distance, relying on Eleanor to do his chores and avoiding contact with the sick. This meant Eleanor, too, was kept away from the doctor's work. But she saw him always moving, always needed. The weariness on his face deepened, lines etched by sleepless nights and the heavy burden of his task. He saved some, lost others, and carried the weight of both outcomes with a quiet dignity. One evening, as the fever raged through a nearby family's wagon, Eleanor was sent by Silas to trade some dried jerky for flour. The family was too ill to haggle, their faces pale and drawn. As she made the exchange, she saw Dr. Finch emerge from their wagon, his coat sleeves smudged with something dark. He caught her eye. For the first time, he addressed her directly, his voice low, tired, but not unkind. "You should boil that flour well before using it, girl. And wash your hands thoroughly." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction, given with the quiet authority of someone who understood the unseen dangers swirling in the air. He wasn't just a doctor treating the sick. He was trying to contain the spread, to protect those who were still well. Eleanor, startled by his direct address, simply nodded, clutching the small sack of flour. "Yes, sir," she mumbled, her voice raspy from the dust and dry air. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Silas keeps you close, doesn't he?" It wasn't a question seeking an answer, but an observation, stated with quiet certainty. Eleanor froze, unsure how to respond. She finally managed a small, affirmative shrug, not meeting his eyes. He didn't press. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. He knew. He saw her situation not just as Silas's property, but as a person in a desperate, precarious state. The thought was both terrifying and, inexplicably, a source of comfort. Someone saw. Someone understood. He didn't offer platitudes or empty sympathy. He simply acknowledged the reality of her situation with a quiet observation. As she walked back to Silas's wagon, the weight of the flour seemed lighter than the weight of that shared, silent understanding. The crisis of the fever eventually subsided, leaving behind empty spaces in the wagon train, the raw earth of fresh graves a somber testament to its passage. The journey resumed, but the mood had shifted. A somber quiet had settled over the survivors. Silas, relieved to have avoided the illness, was no less demanding, but perhaps slightly more wary, humbled by the power of forces beyond his control. Eleanor continued her work, the dust and exhaustion still her constant companions. But something had changed within her. The doctor's quiet words, his acknowledgement of her situation, had planted a seed of resilience. She wasn't just a nameless, faceless burden. She was a girl whose plight was seen by someone capable and, perhaps, compassionate. She held onto that knowledge like a small, precious stone. Dr. Finch returned to his quiet solitude, walking beside his wagon, his gaze scanning the horizon. But now, when she saw him, she saw not just a distant figure, but a man who had offered a moment of quiet recognition in the midst of her despair. A man whose eyes held a depth she longed to understand. The opportunity arose abruptly, stemming from Silas's own recklessness. Always impatient, he pushed his weakened ox too hard on a difficult incline. The beast stumbled, its legs snapping with a sickening crack. Silas raged, kicking the injured animal, cursing its weakness. Dr. Finch, alerted by the commotion, arrived, his expression grim. He examined the ox and delivered his verdict. The leg was beyond mending. The animal would have to be put down. Silas was furious, the loss of the ox a major setback that jeopardized his own progress. He paced, ranting about his misfortune, about the cost, about being stranded. His eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on Eleanor, huddled near the wagon. "Well, this changes things," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Can't pull the weight with just one ox. Might have to lighten the load. Or find another way to make up for the loss." His gaze lingered on her, and a chilling understanding dawned on Eleanor. He saw her as a potential replacement for the lost value, a way to recoup his losses. He could sell her, trade her, use her as collateral. Her blood ran cold. It was the moment she had dreaded, the true consequence of her aunt's bargain made horrifyingly tangible. Before Silas could voice his intentions, Dr. Finch spoke, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through Silas's blustering rage. "Silas, your situation is difficult, I understand. Losing an animal out here is a grave matter." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "However, I find myself in need of a reliable assistant upon reaching California. Someone capable and hard-working." He looked at Eleanor, then back at Silas. "Your arrangement with the girl, it is, shall we say, unconventional. Perhaps mutually beneficial if restructured." Silas stopped pacing. His small eyes narrowed. "Restructured? What are you talking about, Doctor?" Dr. Finch met his gaze steadily. "I am offering to purchase her indenture from you, to take her on as my assistant. It would free you from the burden of feeding and caring for her with your reduced resources, and provide you with some compensation for your loss." Eleanor stared at Finch, stunned into silence. He was proposing to buy her? Not as a wife, not as a slave, but as an assistant. It was an unexpected, bewildering turn. Silas was clearly weighing the offer, his greed battling his frustration. He eyed Eleanor, then the dead ox, then Finch's well-maintained wagon and sturdy horse. "Purchase her indenture?" Silas scoffed, though a flicker of interest was visible in his eyes. "She's worth more than just a few coins, Doctor. Took her on for passage and she's been nothing but trouble. Trouble you no longer have resources for." Finch stated plainly, his tone not judgmental, just factual. "I can offer you a fair sum. Enough, perhaps, to secure another animal or make arrangements to join another party more effectively. It's a practical solution." Silas, they haggled low and intense, like merchants in a market. Eleanor listened, her fate being decided between two men. It was degrading, dehumanizing. Yet beneath the shame, a desperate, fragile hope bloomed. Finch was not Silas. His eyes, though reserved, held none of Silas's cruelty. He was offering a different kind of arrangement, one that promised work, yes, but perhaps also safety, and a chance to escape the life Silas intended for her. Finally, Silas grunted, a sound of grudging acceptance. "All right, Doctor. She's yours." For the sum we agreed upon, Finch produced a leather pouch, counted out the money, and handed it to Silas. "She will gather her few belongings," Finch said, his voice regaining its quiet authority. Silas didn't argue. He simply pocketed the money, giving Eleanor one last, resentful look. "Get your things, girl. You belong to the doctor now." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She scrambled under Silas's wagon, grabbed the small bundle of possessions that were hers, a spare dress, a worn blanket, a tin cup. She emerged moments later, her heart pounding. She walked towards Dr. Finch's wagon, her legs unsteady. He waited for her, his expression still unreadable. "Come," he said simply, turning towards his own camp. We have provisions to secure before nightfall. She followed him, a bewildered mixture of fear and relief swirling within her. She was no longer Silas's. She belonged to Dr. Finch now. The implications of that were vast and unknown, but for the first time in a long time, the knot of despair in her stomach loosened, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of possibility. Life under Dr. Finch's care was a stark contrast to the existence she had endured with Silas. It was not a life of luxury or warmth, but it was a life of order, quiet expectation, and crucially, dignity. He treated her not as a possession, but as an employee, albeit an unusual one acquired under extraordinary circumstances. His wagon was small but meticulously organized. A fold-out table served as his desk, filled with ledgers, books, and medical journals. Cabinets held his instruments, bandages, and vials of medicine. There was a small cot that folded out from the wall, and a sturdy chest that contained his clothing and personal effects. For Eleanor, he cleared a space under the wagon's awning for her to lay her blanket, and later, provided her with a canvas-covered bedroll. He ensured she had enough to eat simple, nourishing food cooked over their small campfire. He never raised his voice, never threatened her, never looked at her with contempt or calculation. His expectations were clear. She was to assist him, keep the wagon clean and orderly, prepare their meals, and help set up and break camp. "You will work, Eleanor," he had said on that first evening, his gaze steady. "Your passage and keep are dependent upon it. But you will be treated fairly. You are safe here, safe." The word resonated deep within her, a concept so alien it felt like a foreign language. She was unused to being told she was safe, unused to the absence of fear as a constant companion. She watched him, trying to decipher the man who had bought her freedom, or at least a different kind of servitude. He worked diligently, studying his books by the light of a lantern late into the night. He tended to his horse with the same quiet care he had shown the ox. When people from the train approached him with ailments, he listened patiently, his hands gentle, his diagnoses concise. He spoke little of himself, his past a closed book. She knew he was a widower, but nothing else. She wondered about his wife, her name, what she had been like, how she had died. Did he mourn her still? Did his quiet solitude stem from grief? Eleanor, in turn, was quiet and diligent. She learned quickly, observing his routines, anticipating his needs. She cleaned his instruments, boiled water for sterile dressings, fetched supplies. She was careful, precise, determined to prove her worth, to not give him any reason to regret his decision. There was a formality between them, a polite distance that reflected the unconventional nature of their arrangement. He called her Eleanor, never girl or any demeaning term. She called him Dr. Finch, always with respect. There were long stretches of silence between them as they traveled, hours punctuated only by the creak of the wagon, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, and the sounds of the trail. But within that silence, something else began to grow, an unspoken understanding. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, her determination despite the hardships she had faced. She saw his quiet competence, his unexpected kindness, the deep well of weariness hidden beneath his reserved exterior. One afternoon, as they paused for a brief rest, Eleanor sat mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she had carefully preserved. Finch was checking his wagon's wheels. He glanced over at her. "You're skilled with a needle," he remarked, the observation simple, factual. "My mother taught me," she replied, surprised by the casual nature of his comment. Before she trailed off, the memories of her childhood, of home, still too painful to fully articulate. He didn't ask for details. He simply nodded. Useful skill. On the frontier, everything must be repaired, nothing wasted. It was a small exchange, but it chipped away another layer of the formality between them. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation that wasn't about tasks or the journey. In the quiet hours, when the campfire was low and Finch was absorbed in his books, Eleanor would watch him, the firelight flickering across his face. She felt a strange sense of peace she hadn't known before. The fear was gone, replaced by a cautious sense of security. She was still vulnerable, still alone in the world save for this quiet, complex man who had claimed her. But she was no longer defined solely by her past trauma. She was Eleanor, assistant to Dr. Finch, heading west towards an uncertain future, but no longer fearing every step of the journey. The arrival in Willow Creek, the small, burgeoning settlement that was their destination, was not the triumphant end to the journey Eleanor had envisioned, or rather, dared not envision. It was less a place of welcoming opportunity and more a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled together against the vastness of the landscape, populated by people wary of outsiders. The dust of the trail had settled, but the dust of judgment and suspicion seemed to hang perpetually in the air. News of the wagon train's arrival, and the stories of the hardships endured, traveled quickly. So too did the questions about Dr. Finch and the young woman accompanying him. A solitary, educated man arriving with a girl who wasn't his daughter, not openly his wife, whose background was vague and linked to a less-than-savory transaction. It fueled gossip and speculation. The townspeople, hardened by the frontier and suspicious of anyone who didn't fit their narrow mold, eyed them with open curiosity and veiled disapproval. "Who's the girl, doctor?" A stout woman with sharp eyes asked him one day in the dusty general store, her tone ostensibly friendly but laced with insinuation. "My assistant, Mrs. Davison," Finch replied, his voice calm and even, offering nothing more. "Assistant, eh?" The woman chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Seems like a mighty young assistant for a man traveling alone." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, the familiar shame of her situation rising. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, willing herself to disappear. Finch, sensing her discomfort, placed a quiet hand on her arm, a gesture so subtle it was barely noticeable, yet it was a clear signal of protection. "Eleanor is quite capable, Mrs. Davison, and her situation required assistance, which I was able to provide." His tone was polite, but it carried a quiet authority that brooked no further prying. Mrs. Davison backed down, but the seeds of gossip had been sown. Their arrangement, born of necessity and offering Eleanor a lifeline, was viewed through the lens of suspicion and frontier morality. They were outliers, and in a community struggling to establish itself, outliers were often met with hostility. Dr. Finch found lodgings in a small, vacant cabin on the edge of town, humble but sufficient. Eleanor helped him set up his practice, arranging his books and instruments, transforming the rough space into a semblance of a doctor's office. She cleaned, organized, and learned to mix poultices and prepare simple remedies under his guidance. She was a capable assistant, proving the truth of Finch's quiet assertion. Their days settled into a routine, tending to the sick and injured of the town and surrounding ranches, the long hours punctuated by the quiet rhythm of their shared tasks. The town's need for a doctor, however grudgingly acknowledged, offered them a degree of acceptance, but the undercurrent of suspicion remained. They heard the whispers, the veiled questions about their relationship, the judgmental glances. It stung Eleanor, reopening the wounds of her past and highlighting her vulnerability. She was still defined by the transaction that brought her west, still judged by those who knew nothing of her resilience or the desperation that had led her to this path. One evening, sitting by the small fire in their cabin, the silence between them felt heavier than usual, burdened by the day's encounters with the town's judgment. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice small. "They talk about us, don't they, doctor?" Finch looked up from his book, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Yes, Eleanor, they do. Are they angry?" she asked, hesitant. About how you came to have me?" He sighed, a quiet, weary sound. "They are wary of what they don't understand, and they are quick to judge what deviates from their narrow view of propriety." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "It is not you they are truly angry with, Eleanor. It is their own fears, their own struggles projected onto us. We are outsiders, and we arrived under circumstances they find unsettling." He closed his book. "We will not let their judgment define us. Our arrangement is honest, and it is necessary. Let them talk. "We have work to do." His words were a quiet shield, a reassurance that he saw their situation for what it was, a partnership born of need, not something shameful to be hidden. He did not dismiss her fears, but he offered a perspective that placed the blame on the judgers, not the judged. He acknowledged the difficulty of their position without dwelling on it, focusing instead on their purpose and their shared reality. It wasn't a declaration of protection in the traditional sense, but a quiet statement of solidarity, a subtle reinforcement of the bond that was slowly, tentatively, forming between them in the face of external hostility. The simmering judgment of Willow Creek escalated into a more tangible threat, catalyzed by a man named Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was a rough, avaricious rancher whose land bordered the settlement. He was a powerful, unpleasant man, used to getting his way through bullying and intimidation. He had a reputation for cruelty and a particular dislike for outsiders, especially those who seemed to possess something he coveted. What Thorne coveted became clear when he saw Eleanor. He saw a young, able-bodied woman, seemingly without family or protection beyond the quiet doctor. He saw a person who, according to the persistent whispers, had been bought like property. In his twisted view, she was an opportunity, a potential acquisition for his ranch, either as cheap labor or, worse, a forced bride for one of his brutish sons or even himself. Thorne began making his intentions known, subtle at first, then increasingly bold. He would ride into town and linger near Finch's cabin, his eyes fixed on Eleanor as she performed her duties. He made comments within earshot, crude remarks about her being unclaimed property, or a girl needing a man's hand to guide her. He approached Finch directly, offering to "Take the girl off your hands, doctor," claiming Finch had no proper use for her, and that she belonged on a ranch where she could be put to work. Finch consistently refused, his polite words masking an underlying steel. "Eleanor is my assistant, Thorne. She is not available for purchase or transfer." Thorne's persistence grew bolder. He began sending his sons to harass Eleanor when she was fetching water or supplies. They would block her path, leer at her, make lewd suggestions, and remind her that she was just a foundling and didn't belong in town with a soft-handed doctor. The encounters left Eleanor shaken, the old fears resurfacing with terrifying clarity. She retreated further into herself, her movements cautious, her eyes scanning her surroundings constantly. The fragile sense of safety she had found began to fray. Finch noticed her distress. He began accompanying her on her errands, his presence a silent deterrent. He spent less time absorbed in his books and more time observing the town around them. He recognized the nature of the threat. Thorne wasn't just a bully. He represented the raw, predatory element of the frontier, where the vulnerable were prey for the ruthless. One evening, as Eleanor was preparing supper, a rock shattered the cabin window, landing on the floorboards near her feet. A coarse voice from outside yelled, "That's a warning, doctor. Send the girl out, or worse will follow." Eleanor cried out, stumbling back, her heart pounding. Finch was instantly beside her, pulling her away from the broken glass. His face was set, his eyes hard. "Stay inside, Eleanor. Do not open the door for anyone." He went to the window, looking out into the gathering darkness. The threat was no longer veiled. It was direct and menacing. They were facing a tangible enemy, one who saw Eleanor not as a person, but as a prize to be taken. This external threat, ironically, solidified the unspoken bond between them. They were in this together. Finch was her protector, not out of obligation from a purchased indenture, but from a quiet, determined will to defend her safety and her dignity. Eleanor, in turn, felt a fierce loyalty to him, a desperate desire to prove she was not a burden, that she could face this threat alongside him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mixed with a rising tide of defiance. She would not be claimed again by force, not by Thorne or anyone like him. She had come too far, endured too much, to surrender to another man's cruelty. The quiet life they had built, the tentative peace they had found in each other's presence, was under attack. The tension in Willow Creek reached its breaking point. Jedediah Thorne, emboldened by perceived weakness and the tacit approval of some of the less scrupulous townsfolk, decided to escalate his campaign. He spread rumors that Eleanor was a runaway, a thief, that Finch was harboring her for illicit purposes. The gossip was venomous, aimed at isolating them and making them vulnerable to his next move. Finch advised Eleanor to stay close to the cabin, avoiding unnecessary exposure. He began keeping a loaded rifle near the door, a grim necessity he clearly regretted. Eleanor felt like a prisoner again, albeit one in a safer, more comfortable cage. The feeling of helplessness was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had come west seeking a new life, but her past, personified by Thorn's predatory gaze and the town's wagging tongues, seemed determined to follow her. The climax arrived on a dusty afternoon. Thorn, accompanied by his 2 burly sons and a couple of hired hands, rode up to Finch's cabin. They dismounted, their faces hard and menacing. Thorn banged loudly on the door. "Finch, send the girl out. We know what you are, harboring stolen goods. She belongs on my ranch." Eleanor, inside, felt a wave of panic, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. She would not hide. Not anymore. Finch opened the door, stepping out onto the small porch, the rifle held loosely but purposefully at his side. His face was calm, his voice steady. "Good afternoon, Thorn. I suggest you and your men leave my property immediately." "Your property?" Thorn sneered, glancing towards the cabin door. "Seems like you got something in there that ain't yours, Doctor. We've come to claim it. Eleanor is under my protection," Finch stated, his voice hardening. "She is my assistant. She is a free woman, despite the circumstances that brought her here." "Free?" Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We know Silas sold her like a heifer. She's property, plain and simple. Now hand her over." As Thorn advanced towards the porch, one of his sons tried to circle around towards the side of the cabin. Eleanor saw him. Remembering Finch's quiet instructions about staying safe but also observing, she quickly moved to the back window, positioning herself out of direct sight but where she could see the son's movements. Her mind, usually clouded with fear, was clear and focused. This wasn't just about her. It was about defending their quiet life, their fragile partnership. Finch raised the rifle slightly. "I will not ask again." Thorn scoffed. "You think you can stop us, Doctor? A man of books and bandages." He gestured to his men. "Get him." As Thorn's men moved forward, Eleanor saw the son reaching for his pistol. Acting on instinct, she grabbed a heavy wooden pestle from the small table where Finch mixed herbs. She didn't open the window. She didn't have to. She spotted a stack of firewood near the cabin wall, directly in the path the son was taking to flank Finch. With all her might, she threw the pestle at the stack of wood. It struck hard, sending the precarious pile tumbling down with a crash and a cloud of dust. The son stumbled, startled, drawing his pistol but losing his balance. Finch, alerted by the noise and the son's distraction, didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot not at the men, but into the air just above their heads. The crack of the rifle echoed through the silent town. It was a warning shot not meant to kill but to assert control. Thorn and his remaining men froze. The sudden noise, the unexpected resistance from the usually quiet doctor, and the distraction caused by Eleanor's quick thinking, momentarily broke their aggression. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion and the gunshot, began cautiously emerging from their homes and businesses, watching the standoff. Their presence, silent witnesses, shifted the power dynamic. Thorn cursed, his face red with rage and frustration. "You think this changes anything, Finch? This ain't over." "It is over, Thorn," Finch said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave now, and never threaten me or Eleanor again. If you do, I promise you, the next shot will not be aimed at the sky." Thorn glared, his men shuffling nervously under the gaze of the townsfolk. He knew he was beaten for now. With a final, venomous look at Finch and the cabin, he spat on the ground. "Let's go," he snarled at his men. They remounted their horses and rode away, defeated but not necessarily gone for good. Finch lowered his rifle, his body tense. He turned and looked towards the window Eleanor was behind. Their eyes met through the dusty pane. In his, she saw relief, pride, and something else she couldn't quite name. In hers, he saw not the cowering girl from the wagon train, but a woman who had faced down fear and fought back. The silence that followed Thorne's retreat was thick with tension, broken only by the nervous murmurs of the townsfolk who slowly dispersed, their curiosity satisfied, their judgments perhaps momentarily suspended. Dr. Finch remained on the porch for a few more minutes, his rifle still in hand, watching the dust settle on the trail Thorne had taken. When he finally came back inside, the cabin felt strangely quiet, the air still vibrating with the adrenaline of the confrontation. The broken window was a stark reminder of the threat they had faced. Eleanor stood near where the pestle had landed, her hands trembling slightly, her mind racing. She had acted instinctively, not out of bravery, but out of a desperate need to protect their fragile safety, to not be a passive victim again. Finch placed the rifle carefully against the wall. He looked at the shattered window, then at Eleanor. He walked over to the pile of firewood and the pestle she had thrown. He picked up the pestle, turning it over in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Eleanor watched him, unsure what to expect. A scolding? A reprimand for acting rashly? He finally looked up at her, his expression soft, devoid of any anger or disappointment. "That was quick thinking, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You distracted his son, gave me the opening I needed." He placed the pestle back on the table. "You were not simply hiding. You were fighting." The simple acknowledgement, the validation of her actions, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She hadn't felt brave, only terrified. But he saw the fight in her, the resilience she hadn't realized she possessed. I just wanted to help," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, walking over to her. He hesitated for a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond a brief, formal touch. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "You did help, Eleanor. More than you know." He didn't dwell on the danger or her fear. He focused on her strength, her action, her transformation in that moment. The unspoken understanding that had been building between them solidified, no longer tentative but deeply rooted in shared peril and mutual defense. They cleaned up the broken glass together, working in a comfortable, quiet rhythm. The air between them felt different, charged with a newfound intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with profound trust and respect forged in crisis. Later, as they sat by the fire, the quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was the silence of two people who had faced a threat together and emerged stronger, closer. Finch looked into the fire, his voice low. "Thorne will likely not trouble us directly again, not after that display and with the town watching. But the frontier holds many dangers, Eleanor. And sometimes, the greatest dangers are not storms or wild animals, but the intentions of other men." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "You are no longer the girl who was sold for passage, Eleanor. You faced him. You fought back. You have a strength within you that no one can buy or sell." He wasn't just stating a fact. He was offering her a new definition of herself, one based on her actions, her resilience, not her past trauma. "We will mend the window," he said, shifting the conversation back to the practicalities of their lives. "And we will continue our work. This place is harsh, but it is also where we are. We will build our place here." Together, the word "together" hung in the air, not as a formal proposal, but as a simple, undeniable truth. They were a unit, forged by circumstance and tempered by adversity. Their arrangement had begun as a claim born of necessity, a means for Finch to gain an assistant and Eleanor to gain safety. But in the face of shared threat and mutual defense, it had transformed into something else entirely, a partnership based on earned trust, quiet respect, and a shared understanding of the harsh realities of the world and the unexpected wellsprings of strength found within oneself and within another. Eleanor looked at the quiet man beside her, the man who had bought her but never treated her as property, who had seen her vulnerability but nurtured her strength. The fear hadn't vanished completely, but it no longer held sway. It was overshadowed by a quiet determination, a sense of belonging she had never known before. The broken window was mended, the jagged edges of glass replaced by rough-cut wood and a new pane when it could be acquired. Life in Willow Creek resumed its dusty, demanding rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted for Eleanor and Dr. Finch. The overt threat from Thorne receded, deterred by Finch's quiet resolve and Eleanor's unexpected defiance, witnessed by the townsfolk. The whispers didn't cease entirely, but they lost some of their venom. Those who had been quick to judge were now perhaps grudgingly impressed by the doctor's unexpected strength and the girl's resilience. Finch and Eleanor settled into their routine, their days filled with the needs of the community. They treated broken bones, delivered babies, tended to fevers and injuries. Their work was essential, and through it, they earned a measure of acceptance, not through conformity, but through quiet competence and reliability. Their cabin, once a wary refuge, became a center of healing, a place of quiet purpose on the edge of the rugged town. The formality between them softened, replaced by a comfortable familiarity, the quiet built on shared tasks and unspoken understanding. Eleanor learned to anticipate Finch's needs, to read his moods by the subtle shifts in his posture or the lines around his eyes. He, in turn, paid quiet attention to her well-being, ensuring she was rested and fed, teaching her to read and cipher in the evenings by the firelight, expanding her world beyond the narrow confines of her past. The indenture, the transaction that had brought them together, faded into the background, no longer a defining factor of their relationship, but a shared history they had overcome. Finch never reminded her of it, treating her always as a capable individual, a partner in their endeavor. The claiming had evolved. It was no longer about ownership, but about mutual reliance and chosen companionship. He had claimed her from a cruel fate, and in doing so had unknowingly set the stage for her to claim her own strength and dignity. One clear evening, sitting outside the cabin, watching the vast, star-filled sky, Eleanor finally spoke about her aunt, the words hesitant at first, then flowing with a quiet release. Finch listened without interruption, offering only a quiet nod or a steady gaze. Telling him about the betrayal, the fear, the journey, felt like shedding a heavy cloak she had carried for years. When she finished, the silence that followed was not awkward, but understanding. It was a desperate act, perhaps, Finch said softly, born of her own fears and limitations. It does not define you, Eleanor. He looked up at the stars. The past shapes us, but it does not have to hold us captive. You are here now. You are strong. You are free. His words were a balm, a confirmation of the truth she had begun to feel deep within herself. She was no longer the orphaned girl sold for passage, but a woman who had survived, adapted, and found her place. Their partnership was quiet, unconventional, perhaps still a source of speculation for some, but it was theirs. It was built not on grand declarations or societal expectations, but on the solid foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet certainty that they faced the future, whatever it held, together. The frontier was still harsh, the challenges many, but the fear that had once consumed her had been replaced by a quiet determination and a gentle, burgeoning hope. She had come west as property, but she had found her own, fiercely guarded dignity, her resilience forged in the crucible of hardship, and a connection with a quiet, complex man who had seen her not for what she was sold as, but for who she truly was and could become. Their journey was far from over, the landscape ahead vast and uncertain, but for the first time, Eleanor looked towards it not with dread, but with a quiet strength born of knowing she would not face it alone.